Okay. Thank you. As Rotarians, we offer service to change lives through valuing the fellowship, friendship and fun in our club. We recognise and acknowledge the diverse backgrounds and needs of our members and community, from the original inhabitants of the land we share to the successive generations that followed. Together, we have a collective impact. Please welcome your presiding officer today, President Paul Denver.
Thank you, Heidi. Welcome everybody to this unique online meeting again. Hopefully this will be our last one for, well, who knows how long, but hopefully a long, long time. We are all due back at the Adelaide Oval next week on the 16th. Trevor sent me through confirmation about that this morning. All of the COVID rules will be in place. We'll just need to be sitting for drinking and eating. We need to wear masks if we're moving around. We need to check in, just the usual stuff that we've done before. So we're all used to that, and I'm sure everybody is looking forward to getting back next week. Having said that, we have a very interesting meeting for you today, and I would especially like to welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Mike Khizam, who will be more formally introduced later. I'd also like to make a very special welcome to our guest, Edie Bransbury. Is Edie with us at the moment?
No, not yet.
Maybe not here. Okay, but Edie is the chair of the Australian Friends of Palestine Association. I'd also like to welcome our other guests. I can see we've got a few other guests here today, guests are Rotarians and any other friends who are joining us. Okay, birthdays, only one this week, Brenton Wittenberry on the 7th, so happy birthday to Brenton. Anniversaries. We made a bit of a muck up last week in that we didn't quite get all the anniversaries correct in the bulletin, and we missed out two very significant ones that I want to highlight today because they are both very big numbers. The first is Mr. David Flood, who has been with us for 41 years. I just find that amazing. 41 years in our club. We must be doing something right. But not to be outdone by David, we've got the other David Seaton, who's 48 years. So again, I just can't imagine that, but he's been with our club for 48 years. That is just amazing. But wait, there's more. As I look through the anniversaries for this week, we have a couple of sort of much smaller numbers. Jeffrey Pitt on 25 years. Congratulations, Jeffrey. And Barry Noble on 30 years, both fantastic numbers as well. But here I've got a name, John Hunter. And John Hunter has had 24 years with us, plus 34 previously. So he's been involved with Rotary for 58 years. 58 years. I don't think John is on with us, but if you get a chance to chat with him or send him a message, I'm sure he would love to hear from you. 58 years, that is just fantastic. Announcements and other agenda items. Please remember to check the bulletin, Facebook and WhatsApp for all of our messages. I'd also like to invite members and guests to contribute by placing donations in the online donate in the bulletin. And as I said last week and a few weeks before, it's very easy to set up a weekly automatic deduction of a few dollars that goes into that. And I know that that's what I'm doing, and I don't notice it going in, but I know that that money adds up and it makes a big difference to our worthwhile projects. So if you're able to get onto that, that would be fantastic. Okay, I'm now going to ask Florian to join us for the Spotlight on Service, but also to add to that and talk to us about the fellowship meetings that are coming up. Over to you, Florian.
Sure. So Spotlight on Service, as people might remember, we started last year a mentorship program with the Adelaide Uni Rotary Club. So we matched club members with students as kind of like a mentoring relationship. So we wanted to kind of continue that, doing it again this semester. Based on feedback, we made some changes. So what we are trying to do this semester is to focus it project-based. So the process will be that, like, we ask students to come up with an idea, a project, something they want to do. This can be like, kind of like, I want to start a job search. I want to improve public speaking. I want to improve on public networking. I want to learn a new language. I want to improve study habits. I want to kind of like do something else. So something where there is something tangible, something kind of like concrete that they kind of like think that they could profit from having someone support them. And then once we get these, hopefully in the next 2-3 weeks, I will then, this is why I'm announcing this right now, I will probably ask members saying like I have someone, I have a student that is interested in that kind of project, given your background, given your vocational career, would it be possible to kind of like act as a mentor for that project? The expectation that we have is very likely about 3 meetings. So essentially have like a meeting to start up the project, to kind of like see goals and consult as like what it can be done. Then kind of like have a review meeting in the middle to kind of like understand how's it going. Do we need anything, kind of like improve on it? And then have kind of like a final meeting to kind of like make sure that like, okay, this is what happened, this is what we kind of do. Obviously, if you decided like we want to meet more often or we do it differently, that will be perfectly fine. But we just wanted to add a little bit of structure so that it's clear kind of like what are the expectations, and what is kind of like the contribution that the mentor can make, and what is the expectation on what the mentee kind of like has to do as part of that relationship. So obviously, given that based on what kind of projects we were getting from students, so we maybe basically signal that like we are trying to match as many as possible, but obviously there will potentially be projects that like we do not have people for to be matched. So we are not promising anybody to kind of like applies to basically be matched, but we're obviously trying my best. And so we'll try to basically do that over the next 2, 3, 4 weeks. And I might be in touch with individual people or ask if I have some projects where I don't really know who I might ask, I might make public announcements about it. Related to that, since I'm actually going to be away for a couple months, fairly soonish, if anyone is interested in helping out with this or kind of like supervising a little bit in terms of the program, so it won't be very intensive, it's just making sure if anything arises that we can deal with it. Please let me know. We're obviously very helpful, very grateful if anyone could step up and kind of do that as well. So wants to basically help with the mentorship programs for Adelaide Uni Rotary Rectors. So that is the first kind of like the spotlight on service, kind of like the announcement. And again, saying it's like it's more of a putting it out there that this will be happening in the next couple of weeks. And then the other part is what is going to happen next week is our first social evening of the year. So Tuesday at 5:30 for 6, it's going to be at Comfort Inn Regal Park, so at Winston's Hotel in North Adelaide, where we had 1 or 2 already before. Main reason is that due to COVID, we can't use Waverley House. And so we thought that would be a good kind of like alternative venue. The topic will be, and so however, because we do have an alternative venue, let me use this. We need to book earlier. So in contrast to Waverley House, where we were just basically free to do to show up and then had like bottles of wine, at Regal Park, we are have a slightly different catering arrangement. And so we would very, very much appreciate and very much essentially expect that if you could sign up by tomorrow, Thursday evening. That would really, really help us in terms of like giving them numbers, arranging food and arranging drinks there. So the arrangement will still be $15. You will get, however, finger food for that and 1 free drink. And then there's a cash bar for kind of like drinks after that. So it's similar to the arrangement we had at the Christmas social evening. Now, so that's the formal part, the organization part. And then now the practical part, what is it that we're actually going to be doing? It's a Centenary Project. So as part of the history group, we are starting to collect information about the club's history, the club's activities over the last 100 years, and especially trying to kind of like add more in the beginning, the first years. And to do that, we're going to use, and I hope this is visible. Wait, which screen am I sharing?
Ones with the hats and the
Yep. Okay, good. That's the right
side story.
Yeah, it's the right one. Okay, so this is what is on there is something called Trove, which is a online collection of digitized materials, so predominantly newspapers, but a lot of books and other kind of things. I have used this in my own academic research, so that's why I'll be doing the introduction of it. But the main point, what it is like it gives us access to historical digitized copies of historical newspapers, and that allows us to do kind of like finding information about kind of like club activities. So one example is this is an article in the Advertiser from 1922, so before the club was actually founded, where there was basically a message saying like kind of like make it a little bit bigger. People are considering forming a club. So what is actually Rotary? And so the Advertiser published this letter from the club in Melbourne that laid out what is the Rotary Club, what is it doing, etc. Now, one is finding these articles, and so you'll go with that. And the other one is helping out with improving. As you might see on the left side of the screen, there's let's see, go a little bit. There's a text. So the text is normally an automatic recognition of the article. Now, as you can clearly see, this isn't particularly good. It has quite a lot of like weird random characters in it. And so one of the things that how volunteers can contribute is by correcting. So
sorry, is it in German or?
No, this is, well, yeah, there's a lot of letters that is like very German. This is like the fun parts. It's like you have like the oops, sorry, the U's, the umlauts, there has a lot of that kind of like in there. But yeah, so the idea is that we can actually start correcting that and turn it into readable articles. And so we can kind of like do that. So we'll go over that and kind of like start out with this and like try to find essentially historical information about the club, and then volunteering and helping with improving that kind of part. And so that's what that's gonna be what's going to happen next Tuesday. So I'll basically go over that. We'll also record it. And one thing is, if you want come and have a laptop to basically just get hands-on experience about using it at the time, feel free to bring your laptop. That might be an easy way for you to kind of like get set up, get started, and get working on that. So yeah, that's as again next Tuesday, and please register on the club website by tomorrow. We'll send out another announcement later today, but that will be very helpful for us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Florian. Now, before I hand over to Heidi to introduce Mike, I would just like to make special mention of our newest, well, almost our newest official member. Steve Morris has joined us today. And Steve's induction will be next week at the Adelaide Oval. So let's see if we can have a big turnout there for that special day where Steve officially becomes the newest Rotarian in the world, as Heidi always used to say. We'll do that next week. So now, Heidi, over to you to introduce Mike more formally. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome everybody. And thank you very much, Florian, for that very in-depth demonstration of the club social evening for next Tuesday. Look forward to that. So Rotarians and guests, many of you will probably know that during February, Rotary International always recognises its area of focus, peace and conflict resolution. So our club has made it a tradition that we have somebody speak on peace building at least one of our meetings each in February. The work of actively building peace and understanding has been a hallmark of Rotary since its earliest days. But with the creation in 1999 of the Rotary Peace Centres, Rotary began a new chapter in this story. and this year marks the 20th anniversary of the inaugural class of Peace Fellows. The innovative program continues to merge a strong academic understanding of the roots of conflict and practical tactics for solving real-world programs. So I just wanted to acknowledge that today, being that it is the 20th anniversary of those Rotary Peace Centres. And I also wanted to let you all know that Alexandra Rose, who approached our club last year looking for sponsorship for a Rotary International Peace Fellow, has been successful in her application. One of only, I think, 16 Rotary Peace Fellows out of probably over 1,000 candidates. So Alexandra's from little old Adelaide, and she's going to be heading to Duke's University in the USA in July to do a 2-year PhD on peace. And she'll be coming to speak to our club before she leaves. So with that though, I have now the greatest of pleasure during our Peace and Conflict Resolution Month to invite another wonderful South Australian, Mike Khizam. And I know most of you have probably read his bio, but I will just read out a little bit about his bio, which was on our website for those who haven't had a chance to read it. So Mike Khizam is a long-time peace activist and supporter of peace and justice in Palestine. He was convener of the South Australian movement against war with Iraq in 1991 and 2003. And he is currently a member of the executive of the Australian Friends of Palestine Association. He is a passionate defender of the right to free speech. And in these dangerous times with the current war in Yemen, the never-ending conflicts in places such as the Middle East, the threat of war in Europe, the rise of China and the decline of the United States, those who seek peace and justice are confronted with struggles on many fronts. And Mike says, to me, peace is what we as individuals and groups must strive for. We need to understand why peace seems so elusive and how governments drag unwilling public into war. Rotarians and guests, I'll hand over now to our guest speaker today, Mike Khizam. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Heidi. Look, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you here today. In some ways, the title of the talk, Perilous Times, it means it's a very fraught time for us. The situation that we face in the world today is something where we haven't seen for quite some time. I've been a peace activist for several decades, and the threat of war, particularly a world war, seems to be greater today than it has been for many, many years. We have crises over the Ukraine, so the potential for war with between Russia and the United States, or NATO and Russia. We have periodic crises and escalating tensions with China, particularly over Taiwan. Perilous times in lots of ways. The world we look at today sees the rising power of China, and it sees the relative decline of the United States. We have now the new element of cyber warfare, and that adds something which makes it even more frightening, because unlike mass troops going across a border, cyber warfare is something that we don't necessarily see. It becomes significant when you think that governments have a capacity to manipulate populations into war, to make claims that the populations are not in a position to judge. So I think we are in very perilous times today. I chose this picture that is up at the moment of Dresden in 1945, showing the utter destruction. Much of Europe looked like that after the war. We've been fortunate in Australia that we haven't had a modern war on our shores, but we've been involved in modern wars, and particularly in the Iraq war. So across the Middle East, much of Iraq and much of Syria now looks like what we've got in Dresden. Looking at that photo, you can see the bones of buildings left. War's the great destroyer of human civilizations and of nations. Everything we hold dear collectively as a culture, whether it be the architecture, the arts, the artistic works of a society, get destroyed. The systems upon which our existence is based, and particularly in modern societies, whether it be the transport, communications, health or education, also end up being destroyed in these modern wars. We, as I say, Australia is fortunate not to have seen this sort of thing, but it's something that has been the reality for many countries in the last few decades. And what I want to talk about, I want to look at the flashpoints that we're seeing at the moment, because each of them seems to me to have the possibility for triggering a world war. Now, I'll come back to the NATO slide a bit later if I can, but the world we're in now is in large ways a product of the Second World War. The Second World War left, as you know, two superpowers, the Americans and the Russians, or the Soviets as they were, and two great pacts, two great military alliances. That's what's up here at the moment. And I'll return to that when I talk about Ukraine. But the period after the Second World War, from the late 40s up until 89, a period of 40 years, Europe saw peace under this situation with the two alliances facing each other, and the theory of mutually assured destruction, MAD, which was that use of nuclear weapons wasn't going to happen because of the recognition that both sides would be wiped out, mutually assured destruction. So Europe had a period of peace, but that period was also the Cold War, and wars shifted to what we call the Third World, or what we called the Third World. So that situation obtained for about 40 years. And when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, we were left with one superpower, and the United States came out of the war victorious. And eventually, the communist states of Eastern Europe fell, the communist regimes fell, and so did eventually the communist government of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union itself fragmented. In that period where the United States was the sole superpower, the things that motivate great states, the search for expanding their territory or expanding their influence, didn't abate. Now the retarding force of an opposing alliance was gone. So we had one superpower left and no fetters on its ambitions. And so in 1991, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the United States formed a coalition to evict Iraq from Kuwait through a massive war, in the face of a peace movement that said that Kuwait was particularly susceptible to sanctions, its economy being based essentially on one product, oil, which it had to export and which could be choked off easily in the Persian Gulf. But the United States was in a position where it could expand its area of influence, and Iraq was a former regime, client regime of the Soviet Union. So the United States expanded its influence, and over time, the NATO alliance also expanded. And again, I'll talk about that more when I get to Ukraine. But significantly for me, the Middle East has been the focus of much of the terrible wars that we've seen in the last decades rather. I want to take us back to nearly 20 years ago, 2003, where Australia joined with the United States in the invasion of Iraq. Now, the invasion of Iraq is very important for me, and it's very important for peace activists in lots of ways, because the lessons that we learned from that, the things we saw there, remain applicable. And many of the things that we're seeing today seem to be a replay of what we saw back then. In the case of the Iraq invasion, I'll talk a bit about the particularities of that, but in the case of the Iraq invasion, we saw essentially the demonization of a foreign leader in a foreign country. we saw the government that was intent on war, which was primarily the United States with Britain close behind, constructing an argument for war by cutting out all the inconvenient facts. We saw a drive to war against a country which was claimed to be an existential threat. Remember, this was 2 years after 9/11, and Iraq was said to be connected to Al-Qaeda and said to be accumulating weapons of mass destruction, which would have meant the possibility of a terrorist attack with nuclear weapons. So a huge fear campaign was undertaken, which bore no connection to reality, and the weapons of mass destruction weren't there, as the Americans had known. But the significant thing for the peace movement is I guess, the realization of that when governments commit to going to war, how easy it is for them to take their populations along with them. Once wars start, it's very hard to wind it back. And modern wars are particularly destructive. Overwhelmingly, they kill civilians. And as I say, war destroys civilizations, and Iraq was destroyed. The things that we saw over the Iraq war, the fear campaign, the steady drumbeat for war by particularly the United States and Washington, were given an extra impetus, or at least not retarded by the things that we would expect to be there. So parliamentary representation in many places failed. There weren't questions asked about the reality of the threat, the cost of a war, whether there were alternatives to it. People don't like to challenge when a government decides it wants to go to war. They fear being caught out and being seen as unpatriotic. And equally significantly, the media failed us. Now, the New York Times itself, after a prolonged period of running every extravagant claim that came out about Iraq's capacity to harm the West, about its attempts to get nuclear weapons and to get uranium, the New York Times, as with so many other papers, had simply become stenographers to government. They weren't critically assessing, critically analysing the case for war, recognising of what war means. We were failed badly by the media. We continue to be failed badly by the media. The New York Times, perhaps to its credit, after the event, ran an apology. Sorry, we should have been more careful in what we ran. The things that we ran that contributed to the Iraq war happening. So governments can make decisions on war, and they can do it for all sorts of reasons. They always have the ostensible reason: protection of the population, wars for democracy, wars for freedom, whatever else. The centerpiece of my argument about the United States is that the United States ended up being the sole superpower in 1989 or 1990-91 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And there was a determination to stay number one. And this isn't my speculation. This is then in the various bodies of foreign policy debate and research, and in the words of government officials themselves. That desire to stay number one, I believe, is the underlying issue when it comes to the attitude and the relationship of the United States to the rising power of China and to Russia, which has, unlike most other nations, not been content to be part of what is effectively an American empire, where the American government gets its way pretty well as it pleases and dominates trade and dominates the world militarily. The United States government's desire to stay on top, I believe, is one of the critical things that is going to possibly lead to war. That isn't to exonerate either Russia or China if we're talking about a world war, but I think we need to look at the pattern of behaviour of these powers before we make a judgment as to where the threats are and where they aren't. perhaps it might be worthwhile to just have a look at the NATO and Europe slides again back at the beginning, if we might. As I said, NATO was formed in the aftermath of the Second World War, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, most of Western Europe, the United States and Canada. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, the two Germanys, East and West, wanted to unite. Now, the Soviets, as they were, agreed to the unification of East and West Germany, despite the fact that West Germany was in NATO and East Germany was in the Warsaw Pact. But they demanded that NATO do not move closer to the Russian border. And the Americans made that commitment, that NATO would not expand towards Russia. Now, in the intervening period from when the Germanys were united in 1990 to the present, NATO has not only incorporated the countries that were formerly in the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet alliance, but they have now incorporated many of the countries that were part of the Soviet Union. The reality for the Russians is that an alliance which was supposed to be about containing Soviet communism or Soviet military attack on Western Europe now appears to be aimed at Russia, which is not a communist state and hasn't been on the rampage. They have drawn the line at the membership of Ukraine into NATO. Now, as I say, when we judge these great states and the way that the world is going and the pronouncements of people, we need to test the reality. The reality of the United States, as I see it, is that it has been striving to retain its position as number one. It's not willing to accept a multipolar world. It has expanded its military alliance almost to the borders of Russia in many places, but it's expanded them to the east greatly. The Chinese haven't been rampaging militarily. The Russians have been involved, as we know, in Crimea and in the eastern part of Ukraine. But the Americans have been, in many ways, a law unto themselves. Getting back to the Iraq war, Iraq was a country that was on its knees. The 1991 war over Kuwait had left Iraq devastated, and it had left it under a regime of sanctions, which cost 1 million lives, and about 500,000 of those were children. The sanctions were ostensibly there because Iraq needed to prove that it had no weapons of mass destruction. The Americans knew as early as 1995 from the defection of Iraqi officials, including Saddam's sons-in-law, who were responsible, one of whom was responsible for their nuclear program. They knew from 95 that Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons. So the whole basis on which the war was fought was fraudulent. The United States action in Iraq was deemed by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, to be illegal because it didn't have the approval of the Security Council. There was no basis in a war in 2003 on Iraq in terms of a threat to others. Even the neighboring states like Turkey and Saudi Arabia weren't prepared to be involved. They did not accept that there was a threat, but the Americans insisted that there was a threat, and they got their way. Now, to give you another sense of the imperial character, I guess, of the United States, during the period of sanctions, primarily during the Clinton administration, repeatedly the international people responsible for the humanitarian welfare of Iraq through the sale of oil said that, look, these sanctions are killing ordinary people. 1 million ended up dying, half of whom were children, out of a population of 20 million. When the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, was asked about that on 60 Minutes, is the death of 500,000 children worthwhile? And she said, yes, well, I think it is. Now, this is an astonishing statement, and it gives you a sense of the disparity between those that have power, those at the head of empire, and the people on the receiving end of it. it's this characteristic of the United States that concerns me a great deal. The other states that I've referred to, and I'll talk about again, the Russians and the Chinese, I'm not saying that we don't need to be cautious, or that we should treat them as if they are immune to the corruptions of power. But the reality is that most of the international wars in recent decades have been at the instigation of the United States. Iraq, the undermining of Syria, the American insistence that the Syrian government be changed, which perpetuated the war, their destruction of Tripoli, their backing of Saudi Arabia. I want to turn briefly to Ukraine now. I talked about the expansion of NATO. Now, the Russians have drawn the line at NATO, including Ukraine. They would argue, as would many other people, that it would be the same as Canada or Mexico joining in a Russian alliance. It means that NATO, in the case of Ukraine, that NATO missiles and massed NATO forces would move far, far closer to Russia. That the missile flight times are much shorter, and they don't see a reason for it. They see it as, in fact, an existential threat to them. And they have decided to draw the line there. So now we have a war of nerves between the Americans, primarily through NATO, and the Russians, with the Ukrainians caught in the middle. Over in the case of China, we have the Chinese asserting that Taiwan is part of China and always has been. Now, Taiwan has led an independent existence for 70 years, since the end of the Chinese Civil War. It's a democratic country, and its population is split between those that want to be eventually reunited with China and those that don't. The issue for us in Australia and for the peace movement generally is simple. Neither of these conflicts justifies a war. The next world war will be the last. Neither of these conflicts justifies a nuclear war. A different way has to be found through. In the case of the Ukraine and the case of Taipei, there are resolutions that can be managed, and the international community has an obligation to do that. The difficulty for people like us and for people searching for peace is the way that these conflicts are being framed now is exactly the way the Iraq war is being framed to us. It's that the enemy is demonized, the threat is exaggerated, the context is very carefully determined, and all the arguments of the other side, like the Russian concerns or the Chinese concerns, are left off. That's what governments do when they want to go to war. Where we're let down is that our parliamentary representation, our representatives, are not debating these things in the way that need to be debated. Where is our national interest? Where is the American national interest in a world war over Ukraine or Taiwan? The media also lets us down. They spend their time talking about the things that the powerful say. When you see a news item on the TV and they talk about China, you don't see what's up on the screen now. You don't see that the US has military bases across the Pacific. They talk about the 3 or 4 islands the Chinese are militarizing. If you see a picture of the Chinese leader, it's with marching troops in the background. This kind of demonization, the suggestion of a country on the warpath when they're not on the warpath, is the prelude to a war, and it creates a mindset that allows us to be dragooned. We need to be critical. We need to expect more of our media. We need to expect more of our government. I want to turn now to Palestine briefly, because Palestine sits within this, the American empire, if you like. Israel and Palestine are in the middle of the Middle East. For 100 years now, there's been a struggle over Palestine. European Jewish settlers colonized Palestine, and in 1948, they created a state which took up 78% of Palestine, and that meant the expulsion of about half the Palestinian population, about 750,000 people. From 1948 to 1967, the Palestinians that remained in Israel, that minority, lived under martial law. So it was never a democracy back then. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, the Israelis took the West Bank and Gaza, which were the parts that they hadn't taken in 1948. That brought the whole of Palestine under their control, and they have maintained a military occupation for the last 50-odd years. That occupation hasn't been a benign one. They have shifted their own populations into the occupied territories. They have ruthlessly suppressed the dissent of those people who don't want to be ruled by a foreign population because they didn't extend them the vote. The Palestinians live as an occupied people without any rights, and certainly not the same rights as the Israelis. The Palestinians living in Israel have significant rights, but not the same as the Israelis. The Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem are an occupied people. Now, last week, Amnesty International brought out a 300-page document describing the Israeli rule as effectively apartheid. Now, this follows on the heels of Human Rights Watch and the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem coming out with similar acknowledgements. So the understanding of the rest of the world as to the reality of the apartheid that has been created in Palestine, the understanding of the rest of the world has caught up to the reality. The intractability of the Israel-Palestine thing again links back to the reigning power in the world, the United States of America. And the United States has armed Israel. It's the most powerful state in terms of conventional armaments in the Middle East. And it has kept them effectively unaccountable in, for instance, the United Nations. On screen now is a picture of one of these Israeli settlements. Something like 10% of the Israeli population has been shifted from Israel proper, that is the pre-67, into the West Bank and East Jerusalem. 30-odd years ago, the Israelis and the Palestinians decided on peace based on the so-called two-state solution. What the Israelis have been doing since 1967, and it didn't stop with the 93 peace accords, is move their population in the territory that was supposed to be a Palestinian state. So the colonization continues. The Palestinians don't have a right to evict these people, but the Israelis continue to expand, and particularly in Jerusalem, to evict Palestinians and increase the Jewish nature of Jerusalem. Now, many people see this conflict as intractable. The other picture you're seeing here gives, and you can show the next one as well, this one is Palestinians going through a checkpoint. Palestinians are controlled to an incredible degree. The Israeli security state even extends to its police spying on its politicians, as we found out last week. This next picture is of the devastation in Gaza, which looks like post-World War II Europe. The Palestinians are basically given a choice. You either put up with the level of control and the increasing and continuous loss of land and the lack of freedom and the lack of movement, the control of your economy and the siege of Gaza. You either put up with that or you get this. So Israel has launched major attacks on Gaza from in 2006, 2008, 9, and several since then up until May last year. It's a very one-sided conflict. It appears to be intractable, but it's not intractable. The United States has the possibility to put pressure on Israel, but it's refused to do it. And it's refused to allow international institutions to oblige Israel to abide by UN Security Council resolutions and the law. The one hope, and here's where the peace movement comes in, the one hope is with the recognition that Israel is running an apartheid regime, something that is illegal internationally, the same as what occurred in South Africa, that people will put pressure on Israel to abide by international law and change its behavior. There's very little pressure for peace from within Israel. Most Israelis they're a reasonable people, but they're insulated from the reality of the occupation that the Palestinians experience every day, unless there's a spike in terror, and terror goes both ways. So the hope for the peace movement and for the pro-Palestinian movement in this particular conflict is the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, which is an attempt to emulate what led to change in South Africa and to the end of apartheid there. That is peaceful protest, peaceful disinvestment, consumers using their right to not buy Israeli products or Israeli settlement products, and for arms embargoes to be placed on Israel. Unless international pressure is placed on Israel, nothing will change. The apartheid situation reality is not going to go away. It's gotten worse. And in the response to the report from Amnesty, we see that there's a long road to go. So the Israeli government and its local supporters have decried the Amnesty report as well as the Human Rights Watch report as anti-Semitic. So this is the ultimate way to bludgeon political opponents, is to call them anti-Semitic rather than engage with the very real issues and the realities of Israeli apartheid. It's not in the interests of Jewish Israelis, and it's not in the interest of the Palestinians that this apartheid regime continues the way it is. The Israelis either have to give the Palestinians their state, or they have to give them a state, or they have to give them the vote. It can't go on forever. And it's been a source of tension in the Middle East and contributed to the wars we've seen. And this isn't going to stop unless countries like Australia take the same stance towards Israel that they took towards South Africa. If apartheid wasn't acceptable for Black South Africans, it shouldn't be acceptable for Palestinians. Each of these conflicts has the possibility of peaceful resolution, but it needs people to be prepared to speak up and not be intimidated. Not be intimidated about saying Russia is not the biggest problem here, or that China, Xi Jinping is not on the march, or that the Israelis are running an apartheid regime. We need the courage to stand up and to defend free speech, the right of people to engage in debate based on facts, rather than have people silenced. Free speech is under attack in the Western countries from left and right in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime. And particularly when it comes to issues of war and peace, if this continues, then our future is not bright. I'll leave the talk there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Mike. We've got a few minutes for questions, so please raise your hand and unmute and ask away. Laurie?
Mike, it was a couple of weeks ago, I listened to a podcast. It was by an American, or it was a Brit who's now in the US, who described his particular kind of like position as like although he's sympathetic to Israel, he kind of like obviously is at the moment, he kind of thinks that like the occupation and so on is like Israel. So kind of like his position was more like Israel's fall. And then he had a conversation with trying to think whether it was a rabbi, but like it was an Israeli kind of like somebody from Israel. And the perspective, the description given from the Israeli was that like every time Israel over the last 50, 60 years tried to reach out, tried to actually come up with a solution, and he gave examples of political kind of like events and kind of political movements when this happened, every time he felt that like, and the reaction was that like they were met by violence, they were not met by kind of like peaceful cooperation, and they were met by renewed calls for like destruction of Israel. And so he said like, look, if you for 50, 60 years get always a reaction that oh, yeah, I'm trying to be peaceful, but the reaction I'm getting hit, I'm getting shot at, then why shouldn't you become cynical? Why shouldn't you kind of say like, look, if there's a peaceful, it's not in the cards, let's build a wall, let's kind of create kind of like peace through force rather than peace through understanding, because seemingly the other party is not interested in a peaceful understanding. And so that is kind of like a perspective of Israel's side. So in your description, it kind of like presents like the fault seems to be pushed on one side, but because you're not talking effectively on the other side. So you're essentially not talking about like what's the Palestinian kind of like contribution in this kind of like situation. And so what is the kind of like agency that Palestine has at this point? And what is the reaction, the perception that like any agency that Palestinians did is essentially not directed towards peace, but is directed towards kind of like conflict?
Look, that's a fair question. I would argue that the Palestinians have limited agency. Israel is a major military power. It's a nuclear power, and it controls all the land of Palestine and all the Palestinians. Palestinians don't have an army or a navy or an air force, so they don't have any pushback. In terms of their ability to control their own lives, Israel controls all of the Palestinian territories. Now, the great underminer of the argument that Israel wants peace is now more visible than it's ever been, and that's their settlement movement. So they have, despite 30 years of supposed commitment to peace based on a two-state solution, they continued throughout that time to build Jewish-only settlements in the territories set aside for the Palestinians. And this is the greatest evidence of their commitment not to peaceful coexistence on the basis of two states, but to an ongoing colonization. And again, we see this in the evictions of people in Jerusalem, Palestinians, to make way for Israeli Jews. So the reality is undermined. The narrative is undermined by the reality of continuing colonization. Gaza has been under siege since 2006. The water, electricity, medications, anything and everything can be blockaded. Water is undrinkable. If you're going to make peace with people and you continue to take the territory that is supposed to be a Palestinian state, if you use these siege tactics against Palestinians in Gaza, that doesn't show a commitment to peace. What it shows is a commitment to continue colonization as it is. The reality is that the Palestinians aren't building Palestinian settlements in Israel. There aren't checkpoints in Israel where Palestinians are watching over Israelis. There aren't Israeli children in Palestinian prisons. It's all a one-sided thing. Now, the Palestinians have had failures and had mistakes, but they have committed to a peace process which has gone nowhere for decades. The Israeli withdrawals didn't happen. Israeli expansion continues to happen. And in the interim, the Palestinian Authority has basically become an enforcement arm of the Israeli state. So for ordinary Palestinians, they have no security. And if you live in Gaza, it is total insecurity, because your life can be under threat at any time. So that apartheid reality is something that is not the doing of the Palestinians. That is something that is the creation of the Israeli state to allow a continuing colonization. There have been periods when the Palestinians, when there was periods of terror and bombings, this sort of thing, there have been ceasefires and nothing has changed. The settlements never stopped. The settlements weren't withdrawn from the West Bank and Gaza, and the control over the Palestinian economy is still total. So to me, there is the most powerful actor in the whole thing is the one that's pushing ahead on the front of colonization. Settlements are the fact that undermines that Israeli narrative.
Thank you, Mike. Have we got any other questions? I think we've got Stephen, Noble, David, Egan. Okay. that I can see. Perhaps, Stephen, I think you wave first. Just unmute, and we've got a few more minutes, that's all.
Hi, Mike, fellow Rotarians. I thought it was a really interesting address. I'm just a bit of the view that there's no real commentary about Xi Jinping and his aspirational views around China, which I think is a major issue in the world today. I think that he has sat down with his leaders and understands that time for China is now. They will be seeing a continued reduction in population, which will be dramatic over the next 50 years, 40 years. Something like 640 million less Chinese by the year 2100, based on demographics and demographic projections. My personal view, and I'm an accountant, so I see the world very much through economic eyes. I think a lot of the conflicts, I won't say all, but many conflicts around the world are driven by economics and resource. I know that the Israeli-Palestinian issue has roots that go back thousands of years and has, I guess, in a sense, a different origin. But in current times, I do think that the issues around China and their Silk Road project, etc., is a significant issue and not to be underestimated. I personally strongly support Australia aligning with the AUKUS alliance with the US and the UK, and I just see a lot of the future of security driven around not war and fighting, but by posturing and resources behind that posturing. But that could be a bit of a naive view, but it's certainly in a view I have, and I think I wouldn't be alone in having that sort of view in the current times. And well, I guess what I'd say about the Winter Olympics in Beijing reminds me of certain Olympics back in Berlin back in about 1930, but perhaps I'm being a bit too cynical about that. Anyway, I think I've said enough, but I do think your address is very thought-provoking and a reminder that we live in a world that we cannot take for granted. I think social media, etc., has made the world a lot smaller, and of course we've become much more aware of conflicts around the world. That is a good thing in many senses, but it also probably amps up the anxiety levels for some of us. Anyway, thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. David, have you got a question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. It's interesting to take different perspectives. As you know, in Rotary, we are about international understanding and peace. And I remember reading in Paul Harris, our founder's memoirs in 1945, he said that there's enough, and he was talking about difficulties in peace and everything, and he said there's enough differences in every Rotary club to blow things to 1,000 pieces, if it were not for tolerance. And so just turning from the problems to a solution, what do you personally think is the way forward for the world in the context of achieving international peace?
Look, I think all of the things we've talked about before about the changing world, the relative, the rise of China, the relative decline of the US, all the things that are going to affect nations in the future, resource scarcity, water scarcity, changing populations, changing levels of affluence, all of those things are going to produce tensions. My biggest concern is that when we deal with those tensions, we need to do it in a way where we know that our governments are not just aligning themselves, in our case, with one side and going along with the agenda of one side. So we need to assess, where do our national interests lie? We don't want to be dominated by China, but neither do we want a war where our national interests aren't actually threatened. The role of our media is important. Our media are remarkably uncritical. Even if you watch the ABC, which is on so many domestic issues, very woke, as the current expression is, when they talk about North Korea, they have to have the rogue state of North Korea. It's like every adjective. We've traded with China for decades, and yet, as of a few years ago, 5 years ago, something, it's now the Communist Party of China, or before it was just China. We've got to be very wary about the other side being demonized. I understand that things are changing and that the motivations of other actors can be changing, but we can't rely on governments to define the issues for us our media need to be critical, our parliaments need to be critical, and we as citizens need to ask more of them in those cases. Because as I think Paul was saying a minute ago, when posturing happens a lot, but posturing and the war of nerves, for instance, in Ukraine now can very easily get out of hand. And the world can't afford that with the superpowers. The Iraq war saw one country utterly destroyed, and it'll be in a mess for generations. A world war in the nuclear age will see the world destroyed. So we need to insist on more than one perspective. We need to be wary of people that just wave the flag and won't tolerate dissenting opinions when it comes to questions of war and peace. Our media needs to be held more accountable, our politicians do, and we need to be tolerant of different points of view to understand the world, and that includes, on social media. I think that's the essence of it, but we need to be aggressively protecting debate and aggressively protecting freedom of speech and aggressively demanding of governments and media that we get the whole story and not just the soundbite. That's all I can see.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mike. Great response. Sorry, we have to wrap up there. That was, I'm sure we could go on for quite a lot longer, but it's hit 2 o'clock. So it's our opportunity now to say a very big thank you to you for providing us with a really thought-provoking and informative talk. So on behalf of all the members of the club, I'd like to say thank you very much, and we will be presenting you with a certificate of recognition, which I'll post out to you shortly, and we'll be making a donation on your behalf to our local and community projects here in Adelaide. So Rotarians and guests, please let's all thank Mike in our traditional way. So unmute yourself if you can, so that you can see all the hands clapping, Mike. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And if I've provoked your thinking on the issue, that's all I'm really asking.
Yeah, certainly have done that. Thank you so much. And I'll hand back to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. Once again, thank you, Mike. That was just a massively thought-provoking conversation, and I'm sure we will be thinking long and hard about what we can do. Members, guests, friends, we've come to the end of the meeting, but I would really encourage you to come along next week, back to our usual haunt at the Adelaide Oval, but it's actually going to be an extra special meeting because quite often members have spoken, I know they have to Heidi, they certainly have to me and a lot of other people on the board, and they say, we'd like to know more about where our money is going, when we're donating, when we're raising funds, because sometimes we're not really, overly sure. Next Wednesday, we're going to have 3 recipients who from our first round of grants that we gave this year. So we've got Karen Percival coming from the Motor Neuron Disease South Australia, Julie Black from Ronald McDonald House, and Helen Granville from Second Chances. Now, all of those groups have been recipients of large amounts of money from us, and they're going to talk to us about what they're doing with that money and what a difference it is making for the people that they support. So I'd encourage you to come along next week. It'd be great to see you all face to face again. I think we're all looking forward to it. That's enough for now. We've got a couple of minutes over. Sorry about that. And but everybody have a great week, and look forward to seeing you all next week and seeing the board tonight for our board meeting. Thanks, everybody. Bye for now.
Thank you.